They say a man's worth is measured by what he won't trade. In a world where everything had a price, land, horses, even lives, Silas Flint was the one man who refused to sell his soul. The day he rode into that dying border town was the day someone tried to make him, and hell itself took notice. Part 1. The Man Called Flint. The desert wind howled like something alive, hot, bitter, and old. It carried the smell of dust and sweat and sunburned sorrow across miles of cracked earth. When Silas Flint rode through it, even the wind seemed to slow down. He sat tall in the saddle, lean as a whip, his paint horse moving with the weary rhythm of a creature that had seen too much. Flint's coat was sun-faded, his hat tilted low, shadowing a face carved by dust and silence. He didn't ride for glory. He rode because men like him didn't belong anywhere else. By the time he reached the edge of the border town, the sun had burned half the sky away. One dusty street stretched ahead, saloon on the left, church on the right, a trading post in between, all clinging to life like drunks to their last bottle. He dismounted slow. Boots hit dirt. A dog barked once and shut up. Silas tied off his horse and pushed open the trading post door. Inside smelled of leather, tobacco, and something rotten under the heat. Behind the counter stood Mr. Barlow, a man with too many teeth and not enough soul, short round sweat beading on his forehead, the kind of man who'd sell the sky if he could reach it. "Well, I'll be damned," Barlow said, grinning like a snake, "if it ain't Silas Flint. The quiet one who don't gamble, don't drink, and don't stick around long enough to bury his mistakes." Flint didn't bite. His voice came low and flat. "Need rope, water, feed." Barlow rubbed his palms together. "Got all that, and something extra. A different kind of deal." Flint's jaw tightened. "I don't do different." Barlow chuckled, walked to the back, and came out leading a young woman, Apache, barely grown, wrists tied in cracked rawhide, long black braid down her shoulder, eyes dark as storm clouds and just as ready to strike. Barlow's grin widened. "A rancher up north owed me bad. Couldn't pay. Offered her instead. Said her name's Nita." Flint's voice dropped colder. "You trading people now?" Barlow shrugged. "Ain't trading, just clearing a debt. You take her, you get the rest free. Call it fair." For a long, slow moment, the room held its breath. Flint's eyes shifted to the girl. She didn't look away, didn't plead. She stood straight like she'd already made peace with whatever came next. That's when Flint knew he couldn't walk out. His voice came steady as a hammer hitting iron. "I'll take her." Barlow's smile returned. Slick, ugly. "Knew you had sense." Flint ignored him. He untied her wrists, gentle, careful not to tear the skin. She didn't thank him, just watched, measuring him. When they stepped outside, the sky had turned, the color of blood and copper. Wind rose again. The desert swallowed sound. She climbed onto his horse without help. He followed, hands light on the reins. Neither spoke. Didn't need to. The road ahead stretched empty and endless. And somewhere behind them, inside that filthy little shop, a man named Barlow had just traded his soul for a smile. Flint didn't know it yet. But that choice, that one quiet moment, was going to set fire to everything he thought he was. If your heart beat once during this story, subscribe now to ride with Flint on the road ahead. Out here, every choice burns, and every man leaves a trail of ghosts behind him. The sky had bled itself dry by the time Silas and Nita rode past the last shack on the edge of town. What light remained was caught in the dust behind them, glowing faint like an old campfire, on the verge of dying. They didn't speak. She rode in front, his Mustang steady beneath her. Flint sat behind, one hand resting loose on the saddle horn, the other close to the colt on his hip. Not out of fear, but out of habit. The land out, here had teeth. It didn't care what you'd done or what you were running from. It only asked one question. Could you ride through it and not break? A few miles out, they came to a dry arroyo. Flint pulled the reins gently. "We'll make camp here." Nita slid off the horse with the same ease she'd climbed on, graceful, silent, alert. Flint watched the way she moved, like someone who belonged more to the earth than to people. She didn't ask questions, just knelt by a patch of scrub and started building a fire ring out of stone. Flint unsaddled the horse, his motions slow, measured. He'd spent years driving cattle through places that didn't show up on maps. He knew the look of a person who'd been shaped by hardship. She wasn't just surviving, she was calculating, reading, listening. When the fire was lit, low and clean, he tossed her a strip of jerky. She caught it but didn't eat. "You gonna run?" he asked, not accusing, just curious. She didn't flinch. "Wouldn't get far." "You might. I don't plan to." Flint gave a nod, slow and deliberate. It wasn't approval, it wasn't dismissal, it was recognition. They ate in silence, the kind that sat heavy but not uncomfortable. Coyotes called in the distance and the wind shifted direction, cooler now, brushing against their faces like a reminder of everything they'd left behind. After a while, she spoke. "Why'd you do it?" Flint kept his eyes on the fire. "Because no one else would, one." That's not an answer. He looked at her then, really looked. The girl was tired but proud, defiant, guarded. There was no fear in her voice, just quiet defiance, like someone who'd been told she was property and decided she'd rather die than agree. He poked at the fire with a stick. "You ever see a dog chained so long it forgets how to bark?" he asked. "And then one day it looks up at you with dead eyes and no noise left in its throat?" Nita didn't answer, but her expression shifted. She understood. "That's what he saw you as," Flint continued. "A thing, something he could hand over and walk away from." Barlow's words echoed in his mind. "Just part of the deal." "I've done wrong in this life," Flint added. "But I ain't never looked at a person and saw a trade." She studied him for a long moment. "Most men don't look past what's convenient." Flint gave a tired chuckle. "Then I ain't most men." The fire popped. A coal hissed in the dirt. For a few heartbeats, it felt like the whole desert was listening. She shifted closer to the flames, wrapping her arms around her knees. "My mother used to say, 'Names are bones. If they take your name, they can snap you clean.'" "What's yours?" he asked. She hesitated, then said, "Nita." He nodded. "I'm Silas." "I know." A trace of a smile passed between them, brief and gone like wind over stone. Night thickened. Stars pierced the black. The fire was just a low, warm glow now. Flint laid back against his saddle, arms folded, eyes on the sky. Nita stayed sitting up, scanning the dark horizon. Watchful, sharp, coiled. "You trust me?" he asked. "No." "Good. Neither do I." He heard her exhale. It wasn't a laugh, but it wasn't nothing either. As sleep came for him slow and heavy, he felt something settle between them. Not comfort, not safety, but maybe understanding. The kind that only comes when two people have nothing left to prove but everything left to lose. And somewhere back in that wretched town, Barlow was counting coins that had been paid in shame. But out here, a man had made a choice. By morning, the fire was ash and the wind had changed. Nita was already up, crouched beside a patch of prickly sage, her back to the sun, eyes on the horizon. She didn't move when Silas stirred, didn't speak. Just watched the desert breathe. Flint sat up slow, joints stiff from the cold ground. He stretched, rolled his bedroll tight, and poured water into a battered tin cup. He didn't offer it. He just set it down near her like a man leaving a coin on a grave. She took it without a word. They rode in silence, the horses' hooves thudding soft against dry earth. The sky stretched high above them, too wide to carry. Anyone's secrets too empty to offer mercy. After an hour, Flint finally broke the quiet. "You knew he'd offer you up, didn't you?" Nita didn't answer right away. Then, "Men like that always think they can name your worth." "You let him?" "No. I survived him." Flint nodded. That was all the explanation he needed. The trail bent toward a line of low bluffs. Shade pooled beneath the rocks like spilled ink, and they stopped there, letting the Mustang rest. Flint handed her a hunk of bread. She took it with a small nod. Her hands, he noticed, were rough, calloused not from softness, but from endurance. "You ever been west of here?" he asked. "Farther than most," she said. "Then why come back?" She looked at him, face unreadable. "Because sometimes the only way out is through." Flint didn't push. Some answers came with a cost, and he wasn't owed change. He pulled his hat lower and leaned back against the rock, chewing slow. Nita stayed upright, alert. Even resting, she was coiled, vigilant, like something half wild and half wounded. The kind of person who'd learned the world wasn't kind and quit expecting it to be. After a while, she asked, "Why'd you really take me?" Flint kept his eyes on the skyline. "Told you already." "You said no one else would." He nodded. She pressed, voice low but steady. "But you didn't have to. You could have walked away." Silas Flint had lived through enough to know when a moment mattered. He didn't speak right away. He stood, brushed the dust from his coat, and looked her in the eye. "Because if I'd left you there, I'd be no different than the man who tied your wrists." That landed like a stone in still water. No sound, just ripples. For the first time, her gaze softened, not by much, but enough to shift the air between them. Flint didn't expect gratitude. He didn't need it. He just didn't want to become the kind of man he'd spent his life avoiding. They rode on as the sun climbed higher. The world. Flint squinted. Barely there. But she was right, thin lines in the sand curving east. "Moccasins," she murmured. "Light step, Apache. 2 of them, maybe 3. Moving fast." "You sure?" "Yes." "How long?" "Half a day ahead, maybe less." Silas dismounted, crouched low, fingers grazing the faint print. She was right. Someone had passed through. Someone who knew how to vanish between the rocks. "Think they're looking for you?" he asked. Nita's jaw tightened. They might be, or they might be running too. Flint looked up at her. "You want to follow?" She didn't answer. Not with words, instead she turned the horse east without hesitation. That was the answer. They followed the tracks into the hills, the desert pressing close, shadows getting longer. And Flint knew, without needing to be told, that something had shifted. This wasn't about debt anymore. Wasn't about rescue or pride or mercy. This was something else. A woman trying to reclaim something that had been taken from her, and a man who, for the first time in a long time, had chosen a side. The sun began to lower, bleeding red into the ridge. They didn't stop. Some choices don't get spoken out loud. They just get made. The tracks curved east, fading in and out through the sand and brush like ghosts unwilling to be found. Silas and Nita rode without speaking. The land didn't care for words, and out here, talk got chewed up in the wind anyway. Best let the silence stretch long. The trail narrowed as the terrain shifted, low scrub giving way to scattered rocks and dry washes. Every few miles, Nita would dismount and crouch low, fingertips brushing the earth like she was reading a language only she knew. Silas let her lead. This wasn't his country. He was just passing through it. And maybe, for the first time, he wasn't just riding for himself. She moved with that same quiet determination he'd seen the first day. Composed, self-possessed, relentless, never asking permission, never needing it. He admired that. They stopped mid-afternoon near a thin trickle of water running down from a crack in the rock. Flint gave the Mustang a break, loosening the saddle cinch. Nita filled her canteen in silence, eyes scanning the ridge above like something might be watching. "You always read the land that way?" he asked. She nodded once. "My father taught me. Said the earth remembers more than men do." Flint leaned against the cool stone, arms crossed. "What do you reckon it remembers about us?" Nita's eyes flicked toward him, dark, steady. "That we're passing through." He liked that. A soft grunt of a laugh left his throat. They didn't stay long. The sun was dipping low, the kind of light that turned the canyon walls a bleeding copper. Beautiful, in a hard, unforgiving sort of way. That night, they made camp near a stand of juniper trees. The wind picked up, but the fire Flint built was small and tight. He cooked coffee over it, the bitter smell threading the dry air. Nita sat across from him, arms resting on her knees, face turned slightly to the flames. "You said they might be looking for you," he said. "The ones leaving those tracks." "They might." "Family?" She shook her head. "Apache don't chase what's already gone. Not unless there's something left to carry back." "And is there?" She didn't answer for a long while. Then softly, "Depends on who's doing the looking." Flint nodded, rubbing his thumb along the tin cup in his hand. He didn't press. You didn't drag answers out of someone like Nita. You let them come on their own like rain in a dry season. Rare, but worth everything. After a while, she asked him something that caught him off guard. "You ever belonged anywhere?" He looked into the fire, the orange dancing in his eyes. "Once, long time ago." "What happened?" He hesitated, then said, "Life." Nita didn't pry, just nodded like she understood. Because maybe she did. Because maybe the only thing they had in common was that neither of them had a place left to return to, and both were still riding toward something that might not even be there. The wind moaned through the trees, low and haunting. Somewhere far off, an owl called. "I don't think they'll stop," Nita said quietly, her voice flat. "The men looking for me." Flint shifted his weight, stared out into the dark. "Then we don't stop either." The fire cracked. Sparks rose up like souls trying to escape the dirt. "You don't owe me anything, Silas," she said. "I know." "Then, why stay?" He took a sip of coffee, let the heat roll through him before answering. "Because you're not something to be chased. You're someone who deserves to ride free." She didn't speak after that. But for the first time, she didn't sit with her body turned halfway away. She faced the fire full on. By morning, the wind had died down. The fire was ash. And the trail ahead felt different somehow. Not easier, but more certain. They mounted up, riding east again toward the rising sun and the thin thread of tracks that led somewhere neither of them could name. They still didn't speak much. But that silence? It wasn't empty anymore. It was earned. They made camp beneath a stand of cottonwoods, their twisted trunks bending like old men against the wind. The creek nearby murmured low under moonlight, carving through the land like time itself. Silas built the fire small, just enough to heat the beans and take the edge off the desert chill. Smoke curled thin into the star-pricked sky, and the Mustang grazed nearby unbothered. Nita sat across from him, legs tucked under her like a coiled fox. The light from the flames danced in her dark eyes. She hadn't spoken since they'd stopped. She hadn't run either. He set the tin plate down near her boot, beans, a sliver of jerky, and half a biscuit. He didn't watch her, just handed it off like it was nothing, even if he was paying attention to everything. She took the plate, her fingers brushing the edge of it, then his. Just for a second. "You gonna tie me up?" she asked, voice low and flat. Silas didn't look up from the fire. "No." "Why not?" "Because I didn't untie you just to tie you back up." She gave a dry laugh, more breath than sound. "You trust me?" "I trust you're hungry," she nodded once. "Fair." They ate in silence, the kind that wasn't awkward, just sparse, like water out here, rare and real. After a while, she set her empty plate down and leaned back on her elbows, looking up through the branches at the stars. "Most men would have taken the trade," she said. "Would have thought they were getting a good deal." "I ain't most men," Silas replied. She looked at him for a long moment, then said, "I noticed." The fire popped. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, long and lonely. "You don't ask many questions," she said. "I figure folks'll speak when they're ready." "Well," she said, "I ain't used to that." Silas didn't answer. He tossed another stick on the fire, watching the sparks climb. Then she spoke again, softer this time. They took me from my people 2 winters ago. Was trading salt down near the canyon mouth. Ambushed our wagons. Shot 2 of my uncles. Left the old ones to die. Took me 'cause I was young and strong. Her jaw tightened. Said I'd fetch a good price. Silas's hands curled into fists around his cup. He didn't speak, just listened. That's what she needed more than anything now. Not pity, not promises. Just someone to hear her. They moved me town to town like a pack mule. First I was house help, then bar help, then worse. Her voice didn't break. It didn't need to. The firelight couldn't soften the steel in it. Barlow wasn't the first, she said, but he was the last. Silas nodded slowly. I'm sorry. She looked up, surprised maybe. For what? For what men did, for what you went through. Nita looked away again, jaw working. You didn't do it. Doesn't mean I don't feel it. That quiet settled again between them, but it had changed. Less space, more warmth. Like the fire between them wasn't just for heat anymore. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees. Why'd you really take me, Flint? Silas looked at her. Really looked. Because I saw a human being in a place that wanted to forget you. We're one. Nita blinked, startled by the honesty. No man had said it like that before. Not even close. You gave me my name back, she said, voice barely above a whisper. You didn't even know it, but you gave it back. What is it? He asked. Nita, he nodded. Nita. The way he said it made it sound like something sacred. The wind shifted, carrying pine and dust and memory. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders and looked into the fire like she was reading the past in its glow. He stayed quiet, content to let the moment breathe, and in that quiet something changed. She wasn't a burden anymore. He wasn't a rescuer. They were 2 people with scars and stories, sitting in the same night, sharing the same flame. Morning rose pale and cold, spilling gold across the rim rock. Silas woke first, as always, gun in reach, breath visible in the dawn air. Nita stirred. Not long after, unfurling from her blanket with a quiet grace he was starting to notice more often. She didn't speak much that morning, but something in her was different. She walked ahead of him now, not beside, not behind. Silas noticed the way she scanned the horizon, how her eyes lingered on the sky, the rocks, the wind itself. She wasn't guessing where they were going. She knew. This is your country, he said, breaking the silence. Nita gave a single nod. I was born half a day's ride east of here. That explained the way she moved, like the land was speaking, and she could hear it. Silas felt like a blind man listening to a language he couldn't begin to learn. They passed through a dry wash where the rocks were carved by 1,000 flash floods, and Nita paused. Tracks, she murmured, crouching low. Silas stepped up, behind her, squinting into the dust. He saw what looked like hoofprints, maybe 3 or 4 days old. No shoes on these, she said. Bare-hoofed Mustangs, wild or stolen, hard to tell, but those, she pointed deeper into the sand. Those are fresh, and they're men. How many? He asked. 3. Riding fast, heavy. Silas's hand drifted near his revolver. Hunting? He asked. She didn't answer right away. Maybe. Or maybe just passing through. She stood up, but there was a stiffness in her spine. We stay low. They moved quiet that day, cutting across gullies and following game trails only she could see. Silas watched her as much as the terrain, how she moved like smoke through trees, never snapping a twig, never wasting a footfall. She was no longer just escaping. She was guiding. By late afternoon, they reached a ridge overlooking a broad canyon where junipers twisted against red stone. Nita dropped to her stomach and pulled Silas down with her. Below, in the low sun, 3 riders moved along the valley floor. Too far to see faces, but not too far to recognize intention. They're following the old trade path, Nita whispered. Same one we're on. Could be a coincidence, Silas muttered, though he didn't believe it. Nita shook her head. They ain't riding loose, they're hunting. Silas looked through the distance, jaw clenched. You know 'em? Not their faces, but I know that kind of seat in a saddle. They waited until the riders disappeared into the far brush, then backed off the ridge slow, deliberate. Silas checked the load on his Colt as they descended. We could swing wide, hole up for a day, he suggested. Nita looked toward the distant buttes glowing red in the dying light. We're too close now. I know a place they won't find. That night, they didn't light a fire. Nita led them to a narrow arroyo, half hidden by boulders and scrub. It smelled of sage and old water. The stars above were clean and cold. Silas sat with his back to the wall, rifle across his knees. Nita sat nearby, silent again, though this silence felt sharper. You're not afraid, he said. She looked at him. No, just tired of running. He respected that. Hell, he envied it. You said you're close, he added. To the red cliffs, just past the ridgeline tomorrow. You sure we should push it? Nita gave a slight smile. They can chase me for the rest of their lives, but I'll be the one choosing where it ends. Silas nodded. That settled it. She leaned back, watching. The stars blink overhead. There's a grove near the cliffs, she whispered. My father used to take me there. Taught me how to read stones, how to track deer in dry wind, how to listen to silence. You talk about him like he's still out there. I don't talk about ghosts, Flint, she said. If he's alive, he'll be at the cliffs. If not, I'll know. Silas didn't press. She wasn't hoping, she was returning. That was different. Later that night, long after Nita slept, Silas kept watch, rifle in lap, ears to the dark. But something inside him had shifted too. He wasn't just guarding her. He was following her, and for the first time in a long while, the road didn't feel so lonely. They made camp under a canopy of cottonwoods, tucked against a bluff that shielded them from the wind. The three riders hadn't been spotted again, but both Silas and Nita knew better than to trust peace that came too easily. Silence can be a trickster out here, like a wolf crouched in grass, waiting for you to blink first. Still, the place felt safe, for the moment. A narrow spring whispered down from the rocks, clear and cold. Nita knelt beside it, filling her canteen. Her fingers moved with the certainty of someone who'd done this her whole life. Flint watched from the fire pit, striking flint to steel, coaxing a tongue of flame from dry bark. He noticed her glancing toward him now, not with suspicion anymore, but with something quieter. Maybe recognition. When the fire took, they kept it small, just enough for heat and a little light. The sky above was black velvet, stars like pinpricks in stretched canvas. They sat across from each other, firelight dancing on their faces. The unspoken things between them had grown too big to ignore. Maybe it was time to start cutting through them. Nita broke the silence first. You could have kept riding, back in that town. Most men would have. Silas stared into the fire, jaw working. Thought about it. Then why didn't you? He looked up. His voice was steady, quiet. Because I've walked away from too many things I shouldn't have. Couldn't do it again. Nita didn't blink. You didn't know me. I didn't have to. She nodded slowly. Still, untying me like that. You didn't even ask my name. Silas's lips twitched. Not quite a smile. Didn't think you wanted to give it. I didn't, she said. Then softer. But it mattered that you didn't treat me like I didn't have one. That sat heavy between them. I was raised thinking names had weight, Silas said after a beat. You throw one around too freely, someone might take it from you. Nita looked into the flames, eyes distant. Mine's Nita. Silas tipped his head. Flint. I figured, she said dryly. You've got that look. Like you came out of the rocks. He chuckled. Low, genuine. First time she'd heard it. Nita pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, then added, They took me 2 weeks back. From a camp near the Painted Fork. My uncle tried to fight him, didn't end well. Silas didn't interrupt. He just listened. They passed me from man to man like a busted saddle, each one worse than the last. Then that bastard Barlow decided I was worth more in trade. Her voice cracked just barely. She turned her face from the fire. Silas tossed another stick into the flames, slow and deliberate. I've seen cruelty, enough to last a dozen lives, but what they did to you... He stopped. Makes me ashamed to wear the same skin. She turned back, eyes glinting. You didn't do it. Doesn't mean I don't feel it. They sat quiet again, the kind that doesn't ask for noise. Then she asked, what about you? What keeps you drifting? He stared at the fire so long she thought maybe he wouldn't answer. My wife, he finally said. Eliza. And my boy Sam. Fever took them both, 3 winters back. I buried them in ground too cold to hold proper. Nita said nothing, just waited. I tried staying put, he went on. But every morning I'd wake up expecting to hear them, smell coffee on the stove, feel a tiny hand grab my boot. Every day I didn't. The house just felt more like a coffin. He looked up. So I left. Been riding ever since. Miles behind me, no direction ahead. And you think that'll fix it? She asked, not unkindly. No. But standing still, sure as hell didn't. She leaned forward, holding her hands to the fire. You're not running anymore, Flint. Not tonight. He nodded. It wasn't comfort, it was truth. For a long time they sat like that, 2 broken pieces that didn't fit the world anymore, but maybe fit next to each other. When she finally crawled beneath her blanket and lay down, Silas stayed up a while longer, watching the fire die, watching the stars blink overhead, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in the dark. By morning, the air had turned crisp, laced with the scent of pine and cold earth. The fire was down to its bones, just a scatter of gray ash and a curl of smoke rising like memory into the sky. Nita was already awake, kneeling by the creek, eyes scanning the horizon, the way a hawk reads wind. Silas rubbed the sleep from his neck and watched her. There was something different in her posture now, stronger, clearer. She didn't seem like a woman running anymore. She looked like someone headed somewhere. She stood and brushed her hands clean. We're close. How? Close? He asked, brushing ash off his coat. Another day, maybe less. Depends on the land, depends on the men trailing us. Flint nodded, lips pressed into a flat line. Still got that feeling we're not alone? I always have that feeling, she said, mounting her horse with easy grace. That's how I've stayed alive. They rode in silence again, but it wasn't the strained kind anymore. It was the kind that comes when words aren't necessary. They moved through red earth and whispering grass, the landscape turning familiar under Nita's eyes. Around midday, she pulled her horse to a stop. Before them stood a narrow ravine, dry but shaded, and to the left, half covered in moss, was a cluster of stones shaped like a crescent moon. She dismounted, kneeling by them. My father carved this, she said quietly. He used to say that stones remember more than people, that if you leave a message the old way, the land will carry it until someone who knows how to listen comes along. Flint stayed on his horse, watching her. This place, she added, almost to herself. I used to come here when I was little. My father taught me to hunt rabbit through that gully. That tree, she pointed to a twisted juniper, weathered and gray, was where he strung the first kill I ever made. I was 8, thought I was going to throw up. She laughed, the sound light surprising even her. You miss him, Silas said. She nodded, brushing her hand over the stones. They think I'm dead, maybe worse. If they moved camp, they wouldn't leave without leaving signs. I'm hoping he did, and I'm hoping he hasn't given up. She stood, went to her saddlebag and pulled out a smooth stone, round, reddish, worn down by time and fingers. Where I'm from, you don't leave paper. You don't leave tracks. You leave stone. She knelt by the crescent and placed the rock down, pressing it just so. What's it say? Flint asked. She looked up. It says, I'm alive, I'm coming home. He tipped his hat. That's a damn fine thing to say. As they remounted, a distant sound rolled over the ridge. Hoofbeats. Faint, but there. Flint's spine straightened. They're still back there. They're getting closer, Nita confirmed. They picked up pace, riding fast but smart, weaving through arroyos and dry creek beds, using cover when they could. By late afternoon, the land began to change, less harsh, more lush. Red cliffs loomed in the distance like blood turned to stone under the sun. Nita slowed her horse and turned to Silas. We're almost there. Past those cliffs is the canyon I told you about. If my father's tribe is still nearby, they'll see the signs. You sure they'll welcome me? He asked, adjusting his saddle. She met his gaze without flinching. They'll welcome who I bring, especially someone who didn't look away. They stopped at another outcropping, this one higher, with a view that stretched for miles. Nita knelt again, this time digging a bit, then placing another stone, smaller but flatter. What's that one say? Her voice was softer now. It says, I'm not alone. For a moment, Silas said nothing. Then, you never were. They rested just long enough to let the horses breathe, then continued toward the cliffs. And as the sun dropped lower behind them, casting golden streaks across the sandstone, Nita rode taller. She wasn't just guiding them now, she was returning, on her own terms. And beside her, Flint didn't feel like a drifter anymore. He felt like a man with purpose. The red cliffs rose like sentinels, ancient and unmoved by time. Their jagged faces glowed under the setting sun, casting long shadows over the path below. It was land carved by wind and memory, a place that remembered every footstep, every bloodstain, every whispered prayer. Nita rode ahead, her shoulders squared with a quiet determination. Her horse moved like it knew the way. Flint followed close, behind, his eyes scanning the high ridgelines, watching for movement that didn't belong. The hooves of their mounts kicked up soft dust, muted now by the hush that had fallen over the land. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. As they reached a narrow split in the canyon wall, Nita held up her hand. Silas pulled back on the reins. She dismounted and stepped forward slowly, touching the stone, eyes flicking left and right like she was reading an invisible map. It's here, she murmured. She crouched beside a flat-faced rock and brushed away a veil of dirt. There, half buried beneath time, was a hand-carved marking, 3 lines intersected by a circle. My father's mark, she whispered. Flint nodded, staying in the saddle. You sure it's safe? No, she said, but I'm sure it's home. She looked over her shoulder. From here we walk. He swung down without a word. They left the horses tethered in the shade, then slipped through the narrow passage. It widened into a basin flanked by sheer rock walls that hummed with the heat of the day. The place felt sacred, like it belonged to the earth before men had names. Suddenly, Nita stopped. Her breath caught. A figure stood ahead, framed by golden light, tall and still as the rock around him. His hair was streaked with silver, tied back with a strip of worn leather. His eyes, dark and sharp, were locked
on the girl before him, as if he didn't dare believe what they were seeing. Nita? Her name cracked from his lips like a tree limb breaking under snow. She took a trembling step forward. Father. Taza dropped to his knees, arms open.
Nita ran. No hesitation, no pride, just pure, unfiltered emotion. She crashed into his arms, and the sound that tore from her chest was neither joy nor grief, but both at once. He held her like a man holding a ghost come back to life. His hands trembled over her back, her shoulders, her hair, like he had to. Make sure she was real and not some cruel mirage conjured by sorrow. I buried a stone for you, he said, voice thick. I thought it would be the last. I saw it, she whispered, and I left one of my own. Silas stood back, hat in hand, his throat tight. He wasn't one for watching reunions. It stirred things in him he'd spent years burying deep. But he didn't look away. Other villagers began to gather, drawn by the sound. Women, children, elders, all silent at first. Then the murmurs started. Someone gasped. A few stepped forward, calling her name like a prayer. Nita turned, arms still around her father. "This is Silas Flint," she said. "He didn't save me. He saw me. And that saved me." Taza looked at the drifter with the eyes of a man who'd known war and peace in equal measure. Then he gave a single, slow nod. "You are welcome here." Flint gave a small tip of the hat. "Appreciate it." The village came alive like spring after frost. Nita was pulled into embraces, tears and laughter wrapping around her like warm blankets. A woman placed a woven shawl over her shoulders. A boy, no older than 10, brought her a carved flute and said it had waited for her. Silas stood on the edge of it all, watching. He'd seen towns burn, men die, and justice twisted like barbed wire. But this was different. This was something true. Later, as the fire crackled and the stars bled into the sky, Nita sat beside him on a flat stone. "You okay?" she asked. He gave a quiet grunt. "Not used to being in one place." "You don't have to stay," she said. "But I wanted you to see how the story ends." He looked at her, and for the first time in a long while his eyes were soft. "Maybe it ain't an ending. Maybe it's just where yours starts over." She smiled, firelight dancing in her eyes. "And yours?" He didn't answer. Just looked, out over the village, the laughter, the music, the light, and nodded once to himself. Tomorrow he'd ride again. That was the only truth he'd ever trusted. But tonight, he was here. Come morning, the village was quieter than it had been the night before. The embers of the fire still smoldered low, and the scent of cedar and smoke lingered in the dawn air. Roosters crowed somewhere in the hills, and the first fingers of sunlight clawed their way over the canyon walls. Silas Flint stood alone near the horses, tightening the saddle strap on his mare. His bedroll was tied down. His boots were dusty. His coat, sun-faded and torn at the seams, hung loose on his wiry frame. Nita approached quietly, her shadow stretching alongside his. She didn't speak at first, just watched him work. Her hands, folded in front of her like she was holding back the morning itself. "You leavin' without saying goodbye?" she finally asked. Silas looked up, his face carved from years of hard trails and harder choices. "Didn't reckon I was owed much of a send-off." "You ain't," she said, a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "But I'm givin'. You won anyway." He nodded, slid a boot into the stirrup, but didn't mount. "This place is good," he said. "Feels like it's got roots." "It does. And it's yours too, if you want it." Silas looked out over the canyon one last time, the way the light kissed the sandstone, the way the wind moved gentle through the sagebrush. It was beautiful, peaceful, but it wasn't his. "I'm not made for stayin'," he said. "Never was." She stepped closer, searching his face. "You sure?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled something from his coat pocket, a small pouch worn and frayed, its stitching uneven but careful. He handed it to her. "My boy made that," he said quietly, "back when he still thought I could fix things." Nita took it, with both hands, her eyes soft. "He'd be proud of what you did here." Silas looked away. "Maybe." They stood in silence, the kind that don't ask to be broken. "I want you to know," she said, voice thick. "I never would have made it back without you." He met her eyes. "You did the hard part. I just pointed the way." She blinked fast. "Then you go on. But don't ride so far you forget there's a place here that'll remember your name." He swung into the saddle with the ease of a man, born to the saddle and storm. With a tug of the reins, the mare turned toward the pass, but just before he rode off, he paused. "I'll look back sometimes," he said, "when the nights get long." "Me too," she whispered. And then he was gone, just hooves on rock, dust in the wind, and a silence that filled the space where he'd been. Days passed, then weeks. Nita stayed in the village, rebuilding bridges that had long since splintered. Her people welcomed her with open arms, but her eyes often wandered to the horizon. Taza noticed. He said nothing. One evening, as the stars scattered across the sky. She sat on a stone ledge high above the canyon. In her lap was the pouch Silas had given her, and beside her a carving she'd started. 2 paths etched into wood, one forked toward the mountains, the other back to the village. She smiled to herself. Not all goodbyes are sad. Some are just the start of another road. Now, dear friends, as the dust settles and the fire burns low, we reckon there's a question lingering in the wind, same as it always does at the end of a long trail. If you had to choose between staying where you're loved or riding toward the unknown that still calls your name, what would you do? Drop your thoughts below. We read every single one. Subscribe now to ride with us again real soon. Stories like this don't end, they just change horses.